It's that time again. Let's look at all the horror I've been reading in both January and February of 2024. Well, I normally like to post these book review videos monthly, but unfortunately the beginning of the year just got away from me a little bit, so I've opted to combine January and February 2024 into this single video, but that's not necessarily a problem because I still read some really good stuff over the course of these last 2 months, albeit perhaps not quite as many as I'd hoped to, and I think y'all are gonna find them interesting. As usual, my reading is dominated by the horror genre, and of course this is a horror channel, so I'll try to focus the bulk of my attention on those titles. But I also have eclectic reading habits, so as you know if you've been watching for a while, let's just say there are always some random other books on the list, and this month, or these 2 months, will be no exception. As always, there will be purchase links down in the What's It, so you can get copies of any of these books for yourselves if you find them interesting, and at least in the case of some of them, you really should find them interesting. There's some good stuff in there, so if you're interested, if you want to get a copy, check down below in the What's It, and you can find purchase links, which is also a great way of supporting my work here on this channel. That's also where you can find all the other information about my projects and where you can do all the YouTubey things like liking and sharing and subscribing and so forth. But advertising aside, without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to begin with my own new book, Arithmophobia, an Anthology of Mathematical Horror. Technically, this was not the first book I read this year, but this seems like the best place to fit it in, because I started reading it toward the end of last year as I was making selections of the stories to include, and of course I've continued working on it well into this year. It's also technically not out yet, although it might be by the time you watch this. It will be released, appropriately enough given its subject matter, on Pi Day, which is March 14th, so that's just right around the corner. Because this is my own book, at least I've edited it, I didn't write it, I'm the editor, but because it is my own book, it would be inappropriate for me to review it. Gee, I wonder if I'm gonna like this one or not. But because I do think a lot of you will like it, let me just take the opportunity to read the description off the back for you, in case you missed my other video in which I announced that this book was coming. Text on the back says, Arithmophobia, which is a noun, the fear of numbers or mathematics. Whether you love mathematics or find it terrifying, this anthology of original tales of terror is sure to send a chill down your spine. With an unlucky 13 brand new horror stories and a bonus poem in case any readers suffer from triskaidekaphobia, these pages combine the talents of some of the genre's most experienced, award-winning practitioners of terror, and some of the literary world's most promising new voices. Featuring contributions by Elizabeth Massey, who incidentally won the Horror Writers Association Lifetime Achievement Award, I believe last year or 2 years ago. My memory fades. Anyway, featuring contributions by Elizabeth Massey, Miguel Flaguer, Mike Slater, who wrote the Necro Nom Nom Nom, some of you are familiar with, Patrick Freevald, Liz Kaufman, Damon Nomad, Sarah Lazars, Martin Ziegler, Josh Snyder, who's also featured in my previous anthology, Rivka Crowborn, Joe Stout, Brian Knight, who I've mentioned on this channel before, Will Forbes, David Lee Summers, who I've also mentioned on this channel before, and Maxwell I. Gold, who is a nominee for this year's Bram Stoker Award in the poetry category, and he is the featured poet in this book as well, so it's a pretty good cast of authors. Anyway, carrying on with the description, it says, these stories tell us of strange and horrifying new geometries, crazed and violent mathematicians, sentient and malevolent numbers, and some new mathematical twists on some classic monsters. You needn't be a mathematician to experience these new forms of mathematical terror, though students of the discipline might recognize some familiar names and some familiar ideas lurking in the shadows. So, pull up a chair, dust off your abacus and slide rule, and prepare to experience arithmophobia. I don't need to go into any more detail here. If you're interested, as I mentioned, there's another video on this channel in which I go through all the stories in the book in a little bit more detail and tell you a little bit about what all the authors have contributed. And of course, if you want to get a copy, I think that would make us both very happy. I have autographed copies and not autographed copies available directly from my publishing house, which you can find at polymathpress.com. There's also a link down there in the What's It. Or you can find or request the book at any reputable bookstore. Next up, which technically was the first book I read this year, was In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. Technically, it's non-fiction rather than horror, but it's nevertheless one of the most horrifying books that I've read in a very long time. This is a personal memoir of the author's journey to freedom. It begins by recounting her early life under tyrannical rule in North Korea, providing one of the most personal and depressing portraits of life under that particular regime that I've ever read. Presumably, other readers will be as shocked and horrified as I was to learn about activities we would find unthinkable, but North Koreans are forced to accept as just a part of daily life. Even linguistic repressions are in equal parts fascinating, because I'm interested in linguistics, and terrifying, because not only because I'm a horror person, but because it's terrifying to think of living under such circumstances. But the book then goes on to describe the author's escape from that hell on earth at the age of only 13 years and at the weight of only 60 pounds. Unfortunately, the journey through hell, so to speak, wasn't over, as she'd escaped one hell directly into the hands of human traffickers in China. It was only after a period of more years, fully detailed in these pages, that she eventually made her way to freedom, first in South Korea and eventually in the United States. Though the book is undeniably a fascinating and harrowing read, some have raised questions of its accuracy, and I think that's an issue that should be addressed. This book is not a work of academic scholarship, but a personal memoir, and it should be read as such. Minor errors of fact and slight inconsistencies do exist, as the book's co-author freely acknowledges, and attributes to the author's imperfect recollection of childhood events, and, at the time of the book's publication, relatively weak English. If you're planning to use the book for academic purposes, claims should be verified against independent sources, which is always the case. But if you're reading the book rather to get a personal look into the life of one North Korean defector, you'll find the book both useful and accurate on all points where it counts. With regard to more aggressive critics who try to call the entire story into question, co-author Marianne Vollers attributes those claims to an organized effort by the North Korean regime to discredit the author's claims. Take that for whatever it's worth. Regardless of what one may think of the accuracy of some of the book's claims, and I am personally not expert enough to validate every line of the book, it is undoubtedly one of the most important books I've read in a long time, because it provides a portrait of a country into which most of us have few opportunities to peer, and it helps us to understand not only abstractly or academically, but personally what it's like to live under the kind of repressive regime most of us are fortunate enough to have never individually witnessed. In keeping with my slightly out-of-order presentation this month, the next book was actually not quite the next I read. There were some others in between, but I'm going to mention it now because it's a direct follow-up to the previous book, and that's Yeonmi Park's other book, While Time Remains. Unlike the author's prior work, this book isn't focused on her escape from North Korea. It's mentioned, but that's not the focus. Instead, it picks up the tale with her new life in the United States and provides a timely warning that many of the things she sees on the American political front bear a certain uncomfortable resemblance to the kinds of things she saw in the oppressive regime from which she escaped. While the former book was more of a memoir, this one is more explicitly a work of political exposition, but it's still colored by the author's unique intellectual perspective. Stories include the author's experience at Columbia University, where she believes linguistic tricks akin to those perpetrated by the North Korean regime are being used against students in the interest of promoting a particular political view. Her experience in being invited to share her story for private groups of elite movers and shakers, only to be subsequently ignored because grappling with her story could threaten their business arrangements with the Chinese government. And even an incident during which she observed as Nancy Pelosi warned a similar group of wealthy movers and shakers in a private meeting in advance of her filing articles of impeachment against Donald Trump so that they had ample opportunity to adjust their own stock portfolios before the news became public. Detractors have tried to paint this as a work of the political far right. It is not. In fact, while the author's own politics may be right of center on at least some issues, she is clearly not beholden to any particular party line. She may very well criticize American academia for being too doctrinaire about their own left-wing views, but she also speaks fairly highly of the New Deal era as one of America's quote-unquote refounding moments, hardly a position taken by most of the American right. Few of us will find ourselves in complete agreement with the author's political views on all issues, but that's not the point of reading a book. We read to gain a deeper understanding of how another person thinks, and this author is in a most unusual position to opine on how universal human traits, both positive and negative, manifest differently under such different political constitutions as those of the United States and North Korea. We may hope that her warnings of fading freedom in the United States are ill-founded or at least premature, but when someone who has lived under the kind of oppression Americans find difficult to even imagine takes the time to warn that she sees things moving in the wrong direction, we should probably at least take the time to listen with an open mind, even if we may quibble over some of her arguments. Admittedly, I don't think this book is quite as good as her first. For one thing, having read her other book, and having read it soon before this one, I found certain sections in this one to be highly repetitive. And if we're completely honest with ourselves, as storytelling human beings, I suspect few of us will find a work of political opinion quite as engaging as a first-person narrative of the journey described in Order to Live. But when it comes to the book's fundamental thesis, that liberty is fragile and must be both cherished and protected, I think we can all agree. As such, this is another one of those important books that, despite its short length, is sure, if nothing else, to at least make the reader aware of global human rights concerns, and perhaps more willing to try to do something about it, as the title suggests, while time remains. Taken together, these two books portray quite a vision. One of life in North Korea, and one of life in America. And as I said at the beginning, they're nonfiction rather than horror novels, but I think they nevertheless accomplish what the best of the horror genre sets out to do. They describe the worst humanity can endure, but also provide a hopeful note as a worthwhile counterbalance. In the same way, the horror genre exposes us to the most frightening of monsters, but also reminds us that, perhaps not always, but at least often enough, we're capable of triumph over the evil or darkness in the world. Speaking of darkness, my next book was a fairly infamous novel called Let's Go Play at the Adamses by Mendel W. Johnson, reprinted as part of Grady Hendrix's Paperbacks from Hell series, and with an introduction by Hendrix. Without real spoilers, This is a bleak and depressing little book about a group of children who, while their parents are out of town on an extended trip, capture and then eventually torture their babysitter. Just how brutal is this book? According to Hendrix's introduction, the author admitted that writing it took such a toll on him that he became a severe alcoholic during its completion. In fact, one could even make the argument that this book killed its own author because, perhaps as a result of drinking to get through writing it, he died of cirrhosis of the liver 2 years after its completion. He never wrote another book, which is a clear loss to the horror and literary worlds, because if you like your horror on the bleak side, and I think most horror fans do, at least some of the time, few authors can do as well as this one-hit wonder. An obvious comparison has to be made between this book and Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door, famous, or perhaps infamous, as one of the most extreme and disturbing works of horror ever committed to the page, made all the more horrifying because it's based on a true story. Johnson's book is not explicitly based on a true story, though on some level it's realistic enough that it might as well have been. And it's not as extreme in its depictions of brutality as Ketchum's work. However, it may on some level be even more frightening in the intellectual sense, if not in the visceral sense, because Johnson goes further than Ketchum in trying to explore the motivations of the characters. Part of it began as political allegory. The absent parents represented the political right, the naive and helpless victim, the political left, and the out-of-control children-turned-captors, the political middle, who, as he initially thought when planning the novel, would seem to get away with things but ultimately crack under the weight of their own bad decisions. I won't spoil the ending to say whether or not that's how things actually turn out in the novel, but at least that initial idea has plenty of shades of crime and punishment. But what the author initially planned as political allegory took on a life of its own. The characters seemed to rebel against the author's initial vision, and their motivations took on a character that wasn't just political caricature, but actually more frightening because we're treated to a sort of front row view of the inner thoughts of the kinds of children who are thinking the kinds of things we might expect could motivate actual offenders, even though this is a work of fiction. The prose is clear, direct, and relatively unadorned, leaving us with a book that many consider ugly. And it is, but it's intentionally so. It's not ugly in the sense of being poorly written, but in the sense of unflinchingly showing us the worst of humanity. And in that regard, it's a work of undeniable genius. The fact that some reviewers who couldn't handle the story took it as an opportunity to attempt to psychoanalyze the author goes a long way toward proving that he hit upon something real. Dark, yes, but nonetheless real, and, while a work of fiction, true. I then took a brief break from the horror genre and took a tour through a couple of cookbooks. I do like a good cookbook. First of those was the Yan Can Cook cookbook by Martin Yan. Some of you probably remember watching Yan demonstrate the basics of Chinese cuisine on his public television program. That was certainly my own introduction to his work, and it was what motivated me to want to read his cookbook. The book is pretty different from the television program, though, and not just in terms of the obvious difference in medium, although that does play a role in why they seem so different. Where the book and show are similar is that Yan's love of good Chinese cooking and mild sense of humor show through in both media. But that's about where the similarities end, because while the show provides a visual and instructive demonstration of each of the recipes, this book consists almost entirely of just simple recipes. It does have a couple chapters explaining basic techniques and a few sketches, but very few photos, of a couple of the more complicated techniques. But the majority of the book consists simply of a collection of recipes. The advantage here is that, unlike the show, it collects lots of recipes in one place, complete with precise measurements for easy reference, which we don't always get on the show. But the disadvantage is that if you're looking for the book to be as instructive for a beginning chef as the show, it might be somewhat disappointing. So at the end of the day, is it good? That's going to depend entirely on your purpose. If you want a bunch of great recipes, it's a great book. If you're looking for a real how-to guide, though, you'd probably be better served elsewhere. Personally, while I always do like a cookbook with more photos or illustrations than are provided here, I'm pretty happy with the large number of recipes contained in these pages. And I am experienced enough in the kitchen that the small amount of how-to instructions are more than sufficient for me. But as I said, if you're a complete beginner, you might want to supplement this book or wait with this book until you've read something a little bit more beginner-friendly. And then I moved on to this short little book, The Lost Art of Pie Making Made Easy by Barbara Swell. This is a short little book, and as such, I didn't really know what to expect from it. But I have to say, I'm surprised by how much information is crammed into its relatively few pages, including some charming historical notes on pies and pie making, different options for crusts and fillings, and pretty much everything you need to know to bake a good pie. The layout is such that you'll probably want to read it cover to cover lest you miss any important details, which might be considered a flaw in the book's design, but it's honestly short enough that this isn't a big problem. And the benefit you'll get from reading it in its entirety instead of skipping from one recipe to the next is that instead of just getting a pie recipe, what you're actually getting is a course on the making of pies, such that you can easily take a crust from one section, complete with notes on different choices of fats and flours to make a crust, for example, more or less flaky, and you can combine that with a filling recipe from an entirely different section. Mix and match at will, experiment with different variations on the notes provided, and you'll be baking dozens of different pies in no time. And of course, Pie Day is coming up, so this is a fairly timely book. My own anthology of mathematical horror is coming on Pie Day for the mathematical pie, but because it is Pie Day, I'll be baking some pies, and I'll probably be doing so from this book. And then, while I was on my little break from horror, the next one I read, which I'd honestly been meaning to read for several years and just finally got around to for whatever reason, was this biography of Benjamin Franklin by Walter Isaacson. Trying to summarize a life as remarkable as Benjamin Franklin's within a single volume, even a relatively large volume like this one, is no easy task. One could easily fill entire volumes on just any one of Franklin's pursuits and accomplishments. His scientific work rivals that of any of his contemporaries. Indeed, though he's better remembered today for his role as a statesman during the American founding, his scientific work alone would be sufficient to immortalize his name as one of Western civilization's greatest minds, and sufficient to fill numerous volumes of his writings as well as commentaries. Similarly, he earned his enduring reputation many times over, both jointly and separately, as a printer, an inventor, a philosopher, a diplomat, and more. Presented in mostly chronological order, with some allowances for presenting like ideas together, this book represents something of a triumph for rendering Franklin's story seemingly in fairly complete terms, yet also briefly enough to remain approachable and readable by most audiences. Somehow, Isaacson's approach seems appropriate to the subject. After all, as he pointed out in the first chapter, Benjamin Franklin is the founding father who winks at us. To put it even more forcefully, he's arguably one of the most accomplished polymaths in human history, yet he somehow still seems like the sort of person with whom one could have a conversation. This book details those accomplishments with appropriate gravity, but also with sufficient humor that I'd like to think its subject would have approved of it. To his credit, the author treats his subject with all due respect, but not utter deference. He doesn't mind describing Franklin's complicated relationships with his own relatives, and isn't even shy about criticizing the relative simplicity of Franklin's views, especially earlier in his life, on matters of religion and philosophy. Though, if I were to offer a word of criticism of my own, I'd suggest Isaacson probably could have taken the time to more fully trace the evolution of Franklin's theology over the years. It's a minor criticism, though. The reader gets the broad strokes of Franklin's thinking from this book, and can easily read the great man's own papers, which are readily available in a variety of books and other online sources. And so it's not as though we're wanting for detail in the evolution of Franklin's thought. It just perhaps could have been developed a little bit more in this biography. At the end of the day, Isaacson's work in this biography is excellent and certainly worthy of his reputation as one of the preeminent biographers of our day. But the subject is also so fascinating, I'm not sure which of them to credit more for the book's simultaneously enlightening and entertaining manner. Next up, I returned to our favorite genre with a new novel, Among the Living by Tim Leben, which just came out, I think, a couple weeks ago. I've been reading Tim Leben for quite a while, so as soon as I saw this new book was coming out, I had to pre-order myself a copy. My hopes were further encouraged when I read the description and found it's set in an Arctic setting, which I think is a great place for a horror novel, combining the harshness of the environment with the relative isolation one can find in such a place. And that it features a sort of dormant contagion being discovered and coming to life also seemed right up my alley. So this one had a lot going for it, but also a lot to live up to. And it mostly succeeded, leaving me with just a couple complaints and a lot to praise. It does raise some interesting issues of environmentalism, as the characters are divided into two sort of camps. One trying to mine rare earth minerals, and another, a group of activists, trying to stop them. But, unlike most environmental horror, it doesn't give us a forced and ham-fisted treatment of the subject. Instead, once the real horror becomes clear, both teams, despite their differences, find themselves fundamentally with the same goal. And as much as one might blame the mining side for the release of the novel's pathogen, the activist side isn't portrayed as perfect or guiltless either, so it provides a reasonably fair balance. It also doesn't harp on those issues. They're present throughout, but confined primarily to subtext, which is how it really should be. When it comes to the actual contagion itself, I don't spoil much. It's revealed relatively early, to point out that it's heavily inspired by the Ophiocordyceps unilateralis fungus, which famously, quote-unquote, zombifies ants. That's revealed, as I said, pretty early in the novel by a character who seems to have a bit more knowledge of this ancient contagion than modern people really ought to have, which is an issue I'll come back to in a moment. But the contagion itself is honestly one of the more terrifying creations in all fiction. It's not entirely original, however. Leben is far from the only author to have written about a contagion modeled on that particular fungus. Even I've published a short story with that idea at its heart, though mine is a pretty different story from what we get in this novel. In case you're interested, mine is in my In the Woods anthology. It's called Parasite, and you can get this book, again, directly from me at polymathpress.com or wherever books are sold. Not to advertise too much, and getting back to Among the Living, though, the result of all of this is that the reader is certainly engaged by the story. As I said, it's a terrifying villain, so to speak, but also constantly has the feeling that we've read variants on this story before. To the extent that the novel does eventually inject some new elements into the pathogen's backstory, and it does indeed do so, some of those new elements strain credulity a little bit. While I won't spoil revelations that come closer to the middle or the climax of the book, because it takes several twists and turns, I did find myself scratching my head about a few of those new revelations. As I alluded to before, some characters simply seem to possess too much knowledge about this thing that's supposed to have been buried in the ice for tens of thousands of years. Yes, folk knowledge and archaeology can explain some of that knowledge, but some of it comes across maybe a bit too convenient. But while some of these criticisms that I've been talking about might make it sound like I didn't enjoy the novel, nothing could be further from the truth. I acknowledge these flaws, at least flaws in my conception of the novel, but they don't seriously detract from the experience of reading what ultimately ends up being a quick, fast-paced, and highly enjoyable read. It keeps the reader tense and engaged throughout, and builds to a climax that I think ends the story much better than the vast majority of horror stories manage to pull off. Y'all know that I've complained about endings in horror plenty of times. This one, I think, ends well. My inner intellectual might have been hoping for some more nuanced explanations and a bit more depth here and there, but the part of me that just wanted a good story was perfectly happy with this one. Finally, I finished up the month with an overdue reread of a classic. And as much as I prefer to read new things, mostly because my reading time is limited and there are only so many books I could get to, there are a few books we need to return to from time to time because they reveal something new to us upon each new reading. And so this month, I reread Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, personally, I read this John Ciardi translation, but I'm really not going to argue here about which translation is better than any other. There's advantages and disadvantages to plenty of them. And nor am I going to try to review such a transcendent work as the Divine Comedy. Instead, I just want to think for a moment about whether or not we ought to call this a horror story. I'm going to argue yes, but perhaps not completely, because it is one of those masterpieces that, simply put, transcends all genre boundaries. We can start with the obvious. The first third of the poem is focused on the Inferno, Dante's vision of hell. And I can't think of anything more fundamentally frightening than that idea. Whether you believe in hell literally or whether you take it as metaphor is not the point. It's a frightening idea. Much horror literature, and in fact cinema, has focused on it. In fact, I'd argue that pretty much all horror is about some concept of hell, whether literal or metaphorical. The home invasion story is a kind of hell on earth. The ghost story is a kind of hell. The zombie story is a kind of hell. And then you've got the more literal, like the Inferno, or something like Drag Me to Hell. So the idea of moving through a hellish situation is at the heart of horror. In the case of Dante, the various lost souls he encounters along the way are, if we read it closely enough, suffering through the kind of poetic justice we often see in horror. But even superficially, their various tortures are the stuff of the horror story. More subtly, as Dante begins the story, he finds himself in a dark wood, and the only way he can return to the straight road is to go on his divine pilgrimage. The lesson we seem to be left with, even from the very structure of the poem itself, is that in order to reach Paradiso, we need to first journey through Inferno. That's an idea that seems to be at the heart of the best of horror. I've said before that horror, good horror anyway, is often rather hopeful despite its subject matter. It reveals to us the worst of all possible worlds, symbolized here by Inferno, but it does so by way of warning or charge to aim for the best of all possible worlds. In the best of horror, it's often the ordinary man, portrayed here by Dante, who suffers the evils of Inferno, finds his resolve or redemption in Purgatorio, and ultimately triumphs in Paradiso by defeating whatever monster might be the focus of a given horror story. So I think the structure of the Divine Comedy really is similar to the structure of a horror story, with perhaps the only fundamental difference being that Dante divides his time evenly between the three cosmic levels, whereas the horror story often spends its time more exclusively in Inferno, with only the faint promise of Paradiso hinted at as a hopeful vision of what could be if only the hero can find the strength to succeed, and perhaps realized only in the story's denouement. A good example comes right at the beginning. The opening lines of Canto 3 give us the inscription on the gates of Inferno. In this translation, that inscription reads, "I am the way into the city of woe. I am the way to a forsaken people. I am the way into eternal sorrow. Sacred justice moved my architect. I was raised here by divine omnipotence, primordial love, and ultimate intellect. Only those elements time cannot wear were made before me, and beyond time I stand. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." And we see the same thing in horror. Some horror genuinely is hopeless, but much of it only appears to be hopeless. Amidst the hopelessness of the zombie apocalypse, the characters in a zombie story find the will to survive and the hope for a new civilization. Amidst the hopelessness of a dystopian future, a few willful people dare to dream of a better life. Amidst the hopelessness of the ghost story, sapping hope from us both in the context of the living under threat by the spirits and in the context of the spirits themselves, forever damned to haunt some old house or hotel or whatever it might be, there's always hope, even if that hope is merely to escape long enough to live another day. And the same is true in Dante. The souls permanently damned to the Inferno are there of their own accord in many ways, but Dante himself proves the lie of the inscription because he carries on for another 97 cantos, ultimately glimpsing the heights of Paradiso itself. He enters Inferno, but needn't abandon all hope, in other words. From another perspective, one can argue that the Paradiso might be even more frightening than the Inferno. Inferno, as horrible as it is, remains within our comprehension. Dante understands the souls he encounters there. He even recognizes most of them, which is why this is famously also a political work, because it comments on the characters of various people that he places in the different cosmic levels. But even when he doesn't understand a particular soul, Virgil is able to provide a suitable explanation. But by the time he reaches the Empyrean at the end of Paradiso, he's come face to face with something he cannot even begin to comprehend, namely the sight of God himself. He may be encountering the greatest good instead of the greatest evil, which he's already left behind. He encounters Satan or Lucifer at the heart of Inferno. But on some level, what he encounters in Paradiso might be even more terrifying. While the Inferno may provide a warning against our vices, the Paradiso, and particularly the Empyrean at the end of Paradiso, provides an unattainable standard for us. And unattainable standards are arguably about the most frightening thing with which we can grapple. There's also a kind of meta-horror for those of us who spend our time on literary pursuits, or on anything creative for that matter. And that horror is the idea that Dante achieved something so remarkable in the Divine Comedy that none of us seem to stand a chance of ever even approaching it. I mean, we're still reading this poem more than 700 years later. Even T.S. Eliot said, "Dante and Shakespeare divide the modern world between them. There is no third." So the horrifying question is, what are we even doing when something so rich is already right here on our bookcases? But I'll wrap up this video and leave you with the thought that Dante himself, as he reached the end of his story and wrapped up his description of Paradiso, acknowledges the inadequacy of his own words. The very same words we've been studying for 7 centuries, the author himself acknowledges as inadequate. He's just doing his best, he says, and he hopes someone will come along who can do better. I doubt any of us will achieve it, but as long as we're talking about hopeful messages within even the most frightening of literature, I think that's something we can all hope and strive to achieve. And with that, I'll simply remind you to like, share, subscribe, and check down in the What's It where you can find all the information you need to order these books and my books for yourselves. And as always, take care and stay scared.